The crosshair settled on a man who would be dead in 3 seconds. Sara Kincaid's finger rested on the trigger, pressure building, the way it always did in this dream. The same dream. Every night for 18 months. The voice in her radio was calm, professional, the kind of calm that comes from 100 missions where calm kept people alive. Cleared hot, take the shot. She fired. The world compressed into that single moment. The recoil, the sight picture breaking, the half-second of flight time at 600 meters. And then the explosion. Not the target, something else, somewhere behind him. A fireball that turned night into day and erased 3 voices from the radio in the span of a heartbeat. Sara woke, 3 in the morning. Montana darkness pressed against the cabin windows. Her right shoulder ached where the old shrapnel scar pulled tight when she moved wrong. She was moving wrong now, sitting up too fast, breathing like she'd been running. The sheets were damp. She didn't bother checking if it was sweat or something else. Outside, the wind moved through the pines with a sound that was almost but not quite like rotor blades. She stood, walked barefoot across cold floorboards to the window. The mountains were black shapes against a blacker sky. Somewhere out there, in another country, in another time, 3 men had died because she had confirmed bad intel. The math didn't work. They were gone. She was here. No amount of Montana silence would balance that equation. The rifle case sat in the corner near the door, dust on the latches. She hadn't opened it in a year and a half. Hadn't needed to. Hunting guides used different weapons, lighter, simpler. Nothing that required the kind of precision that kept you awake at night remembering who you'd failed to save. Dawn came slowly, the way it always did at 7,200 feet. By 6, she had coffee going and was watching the valley lighten from black to gray to that particular gold that only happened in high country October. By 7, her client was pulling up the gravel drive in a rental SUV that had never seen mud before yesterday. Middle-aged, soft hands, the kind of man who paid good money to feel dangerous for a weekend. Sara met him at the truck. Professional, distant, the way she met everyone now. "You ready?" He nodded, trying to project confidence he didn't have. Sara saw it in the way he checked his rifle 3 times before they even left the porch. Fear disguised as preparation. They hiked 2 miles to the ridge where she'd scouted elk sign the week before. The client huffed. She didn't. 5 years in the Marines and 4 deployments had taught her body what steep ground meant and how to move across it without broadcasting presence to everything in a 10-mile radius. The elk were where she'd expected them to be. She set up the client at 300 yards. Good light, no wind. A shot an average hunter could make on a good day if they controlled their breathing and didn't think too hard about what came after the trigger broke. He missed. The elk scattered into the timber. The client swore. Sara waited. "You're gripping too tight," she said. He looked at her. Fear tightens. Tightness kills accuracy. Breathe. Stop thinking about the shot. Think about what happens after. What happens after? You either walk down there and field dress an elk, or you go home and tell people you saw one. Either way, the mountain doesn't care. The elk doesn't care. The only person who cares is you. So stop caring and just shoot. He stared at her like she'd said something profound. She hadn't. It was just mechanics. The same mechanics that had kept her alive through 4 deployments in places where mechanics had failed and people had died anyway. The client took another shot. Hit. The elk dropped. He turned to her, grinning, waiting for congratulations. "You could have made that shot in your sleep," he said. Sara picked up her pack. "That's the problem. I do." She was cleaning the client's kill when the black SUV came up the valley road. Sara saw it a mile out, dust rising behind it on the gravel switchbacks. Government plates. Or Contractor. Same difference anymore. She kept working, knife moving through membrane and muscle with the efficiency of someone who'd done this enough times that thinking wasn't required. The SUV stopped 50 yards from where she was working. Door opened. Man stepped out. Daniel Cross was 62 years old and looked like he'd earned every year the hard way. Gray hair cut military short. Face like weathered granite. He'd been her father's teammate once, back when her father was still alive, and Sara was still young enough to believe that good men doing hard things meant the world got better instead of just bloodier. Daniel didn't approach immediately. He stood by the truck, waiting, making her come to him or making her refuse. Either way, establishing that this conversation was happening on terms she didn't control. Sara wiped the knife clean and walked over. "I told you not to find me," she said. "I'm not here for me, I'm here for them." He handed her a folder. tan, unmarked, the kind of folder that contained things people weren't supposed to know about unless they needed to know, and sometimes not even then. Sara didn't take it. "I'm done," she said. "You're 27. That's not done. That's hiding. Call it what you want. Answer's no." Daniel held the folder steady, patient, the way he'd always been patient, even when patience cost time and time cost lives. "Your father would have gone." Sarah's eyes went cold in a way that would have made most men step back. Daniel didn't step back. He'd known her since she was 12. He'd seen that look before, knew where it came from. "Don't," she said. "Tom Kincaid wouldn't let Kunduz end him. You're letting it end you. 3 operators died because of my intel confirmation. I missed something. They're gone. I'm here. Math doesn't work, Daniel." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something she hadn't expected. "What if I told you this course isn't what you think? All courses are the same. Shoot far, shoot fast, go home. Not this one. This one has a purpose you'll want to hear. I don't want anything except for you to leave." One of the instructors worked Kunduz too. He has information about what really happened. Information they didn't put in your after-action report. Sara stopped. This was bait. She knew it was bait. 18 months of therapy and 3 failed attempts at normal civilian life had taught her to recognize when someone was using her guilt as leverage. But knowing it was bait didn't make it less effective. Daniel set the folder on the hood of her truck. 2 weeks, Fort Carson, advanced course, 15 shooters, best in their fields, and 1 instructor who has answers about Kunduz that you didn't get from the investigation board. You want to know what really happened that night? Why the intel was wrong? Who gave it? What they're doing about it? Come to Carson. He walked back to the SUV, got in, pulled away, didn't look back. Sara stood in the October cold and stared at the folder. She didn't open it for an hour, just stood there while the light changed and the shadows lengthened. And somewhere in the valley below her, client was probably wondering where his guide had gone. Finally, she picked it up, opened it. Cover page read, Advanced Long-Range Precision Course, Classified Evaluation. Below that, a list of 15 names. She recognized some of them. SEALs, Rangers, Marine Scout snipers who'd made shots that became legend in the quiet professional circles where legends were made by people who never talked about them. At the bottom of the list, S. Kincaid, Contractor. Beneath her name, small text in red, psychological clearance required. Sara's jaw tightened. This wasn't training. This was something else. The question was what, and whether finding out was worth 2 weeks of pretending she could go back to being the person she'd been before Kunduz had carved out the parts of her that used to believe in things like good intel and clean missions. She got in her truck and drove home. The folder sat on the passenger seat the whole way. She didn't touch it again until after dark. The drive to Colorado took 11 hours. Sara left Montana at 4 in the morning. Nevada plates on her beat-up Silverado catching pre-dawn light as she dropped south through Wyoming. The truck had 200,000 miles on it and a check engine light that had been on so long she'd stopped noticing. The rifle case rode in the bed, strapped down under a tarp that had seen better decades. She crossed into Colorado just after noon. The mountains changed character here, sharper, more severe, less forgiving. The kind of terrain that punished mistakes and rewarded people who paid attention to details that didn't seem important until they were. Fort Carson sat in the high country west of Colorado Springs, accessible only by a single road that switched backed up through national forest for 18 miles before reaching a checkpoint that didn't appear on any civilian map. Sara had been here once before, in another life, when she'd been young enough to think that being selected for advanced training meant something more than being useful until you weren't. The guards at the checkpoint checked her ID 3 times, ran her plates, made a phone call, checked her ID again, finally waved her through. The facility itself was small, utilitarian, 2 barracks buildings, 1 admin structure, a mess hall that probably served food designed for function rather than taste. Beyond the buildings, the valley opened into a natural rifle range that ran north to south for nearly 4 miles, carved into the landscape like a scar that had healed wrong and left a mark. Sara parked at the far edge of the lot. Her truck looked out of place among the row of tactical vehicles with their clean paint and functioning wipers. She sat for a moment, hands on the wheel, looking at the mountains that ring the facility like walls of a prison built from stone and altitude. Then she got out and walked toward the admin building. Halfway there, she stopped, turned, Scan the ridgeline 800 meters to the east. It took her 5 seconds to spot the hide. Camouflage netting, probable spotting scope, instructor observation post. They were watching intake, evaluating people before they even signed in. Smart or paranoid, or both. She filed that information away and kept walking. The admin building was cinder block, painted the color of institutional indifference. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed with a frequency that made her back teeth ache. A desk sat near the entrance. Behind it, a woman in civilian clothes who looked like she'd never held a rifle, but had probably held plenty of psychological evaluation forms. Name? Sara Kincaid. The woman typed, paused, typed more. Her eyes did something subtle that Sara had been trained to recognize. Recognition, concern, curiosity, filed under professional neutrality. You're listed as contractor, the woman said. Correct. Prior service? Marine Corps Scout Sniper, 2018 to 2023. The woman typed that in too, even though it was almost certainly already in whatever file she was reading. Any medical conditions we should be aware of? No. It was a lie. Sara had been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress 18 months ago. Nightmares, hypervigilance, intrusive thoughts. The whole catalog of what happened when someone did terrible things for good reasons and then came home to discover that knowing the reasons were good didn't make the things less terrible. You'll need to see medical before course start. Formality, room 112 down the hall. Sara nodded, took the key card she was handed, walked down a hallway that smelled like disinfectant and old coffee. Room 112 was labeled medical evaluation. Inside, a man in a white coat who looked more like a professor than a doctor. Late 50s, reading glasses, the kind of face that had spent more time analyzing data than seeing patients. Have a seat, he said. Sara sat. How are you sleeping? Fine. Another lie. He wrote something down. Any nightmares? No. Third lie. He wrote that down too. Stress level? Low. Fourth. He smiled slightly. Not buying it but not challenging it either. You missed a shot yesterday during intake eval. What happened? Sara frowned. Yesterday she'd been in Montana cleaning an elk. Then she understood. They'd been watching her before she even arrived. Satellite surveillance of the rifle range near her cabin probably. Or drones. Or informants in the local hunting community. It didn't matter how. What mattered was they'd been evaluating her before she knew evaluation had started. Wind call was off, she said. Wind was calm yesterday. Then I rushed. The man wrote more notes. Sara watched his pen move and knew what he was writing, even though she couldn't read the words. Subject demonstrates consistent pattern of deception regarding psychological state, likely PTSD, requires further observation. You ever hesitate on a shot during service, he asked. Everyone hesitates, even at cost of mission, especially then. Hesitation means you're thinking. Thinking keeps people alive, or gets them killed if you hesitate too long. Sara stood up. Are we done? The man looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. Yes, thank you, Miss Kincaid. She walked out, down the hall, through the admin building, into October air that tasted like pine and altitude and something else she couldn't name. Freedom, maybe, or the last breath before going underwater. The barracks were basic. 8 bunks, 4 already claimed. 3 men sat at the far end, talking in the low voices of people who'd worked together before or recognized each other's reputations. They stopped when Sara entered. The first man was built like a linebacker who'd spent too much time in the gym and not enough time running. Navy SEAL trident tattooed on his left forearm, call sign probably something aggressive. Hawk or hammer, or one of those single-syllable words that made men feel dangerous. You sure you got the right building, ma'am, he said. His tone was friendly, his eyes weren't. I'm sure. Sara set her gear down on an empty bunk. Didn't engage further. The men watched her unpack. Rifle case, small duffel, 1 photograph, face down on the bunk shelf. She didn't look at the photo, hadn't looked at it in 6 months. Didn't need to. She knew what it showed. 4 people in desert fatigues. 3 of them crossed out with black marker. Contractor, the SEALs said to the others. Loud enough for Sara to hear. Here for the paycheck, not the craft. Sara ignored him. Unpacked her gear with the efficiency of someone who'd lived out of a rucksack for years and knew exactly where everything needed to be. The silence stretched. The men eventually went back to their conversation. Sara finished unpacking and walked to the window. Outside, the valley was turning gold in late afternoon light. Somewhere down there was a rifle range where tomorrow she'd be expected to prove she belonged here. The question was whether she wanted to belong here. Whether 2 weeks of pretending she was still the person who'd earned the right to be called Marine Scout Sniper was worth whatever answers Daniel had dangled like bait in front of someone too desperate to refuse it. That evening, there was a mandatory social hour in the mess hall. Evaluation disguised as camaraderie. Sara had seen it before. The informal gathering where people's guard was down and evaluators watched to see who clustered with who isolated, who drank too much, who talked too loud, who couldn't make eye contact. She stood near the window with a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. 15 shooters filled the room. Some she recognized by reputation. Others were new faces attached to old stories. The SEAL from her barracks was there, name tape reading Garrett. Next to him, an Army Ranger named Davis, a Marine with the build of someone who ran mountains for fun. Others whose names she didn't catch, but whose bearings screamed special operations. She was the only woman. That wasn't new. She'd been the only woman in a lot of rooms. What was new was the weight of being evaluated while being the only woman in the room. Different calculus, different pressure. Daniel entered. He was wearing instructor tags now. He didn't acknowledge Sara directly. Didn't need to. She knew he knew she was watching him and that he was watching her watch him. Behind Daniel, another man entered. Older. Colonel's insignia. Combat patches from Iraq and Afghanistan covering his right sleeve like a resume written in thread. His name tape read Briggs. He had the kind of face that had given hard orders and lived with the consequences. "Gentlemen," Briggs said, and then he paused, looked directly at Sara, and "Shooter, welcome." That was the acknowledgement, one word. Then he moved on. "Next 2 weeks will determine who among you is selected for a classified program. That program will save American lives. One of you will be chosen. 14 will go home with advanced training." He didn't explain that program. Didn't need to. Everyone in this room knew that unexplained programs were the ones that mattered. The ones that happened in places that didn't exist and were executed by people whose names never appeared in citations. Briggs dismissed them. Sara stayed by the window, watched the room empty, watched Daniel and Briggs walk toward the admin building, talking in low voices. Watched the way Briggs moved, the slight limp in his left leg that suggested old injury, probably shrapnel, probably from the same kind of explosion that had left Sara with her shoulder scar. Later, after lights out, Sara lay in her bunk and stared at the ceiling. Around her, men slept, or pretended to. She could hear the rhythms of their breathing, some steady, some not. One man 2 bunks over was having a nightmare. She could tell from the way his breath caught every few minutes like he was drowning on dry land. She knew that rhythm, had lived it, still lived it. Somewhere outside, wind moved through the valley with a sound like distant thunder. Sara closed her eyes, thought about Daniel's promise, information about Kunduz, about what really happened, about who gave bad intel and why 3 men were dead and she was here, and whether knowing would change anything or just add details to a story she already knew how to hate. She didn't sleep that night, didn't really expect to. Morning came whether she was ready or not. Day 1 started in a classroom that smelled like whiteboard markers and the particular staleness that came from rooms where air recirculated but never quite refreshed. Master Sergeant Keller stood at the front, late 40s, the kind of lean that came from a lifetime of running and rucking and refusing to accept that age meant slowing down. "Ballistics fundamentals," Keller said. "I know you all think you know this. You don't. Not at the ranges we'll be shooting. Not in the conditions we'll be creating." He went through it. Minutes of angle, Coriolis effect, spin drift, the way a bullet at extreme range stopped being a simple ballistic arc and became a physics problem, complicated by planetary rotation and barrel twist and air density that changed with every foot of altitude. Sara sat in the back row, took minimal notes. She already knew this, had known it for years, had calculated these numbers in her head while lying prone on ridgelines waiting for targets who might or might not appear, and whose appearance might or might not mean someone lived or died, depending on whether she'd done the math right. At 1,500 meters, Keller asked the room, "How much does a 10-degree temperature change affect bullet drop?" Silence. Nobody wanted to be first. First meant being wrong in front of people who'd remember. Sara knew the answer, didn't raise her hand, murmured it under her breath out of habit. 4 to 6 inches depending on load and altitude. Keller caught it. "You have something to say, Miss Kincaid?" She met his eyes, repeated it louder. 4 to 6 inches. Colder air is denser, increases drag, bullet drops more. Keller nodded once. Curt, professional. Correct. He moved on. The room relaxed. Sara went back to not taking notes. Lunch was basic. Sandwiches and coffee and fruit that had traveled too far to taste like anything real. The men clustered in groups. Sara sat alone. Not quite isolated, but not quite part of anything. A position she'd occupied for 18 months and had gotten used to in the way people get used to chronic pain. Jake Torres sat down near her. Not with her. Near. Army Special Forces. Hispanic. 32. Face that had seen hard miles but hadn't let them show in his eyes yet. You prior service, he asked? Marines, 5 years. Where'd you deploy? Sara paused. Thought about the answer. The truth. Middle East. Afghanistan. He nodded, didn't push. That was the mark of someone who'd been there. People who'd deployed didn't need details. Didn't want them. The names of places were enough. They ate in comfortable silence. When Torres left, he nodded once. Sara nodded back. It wasn't friendship. It was acknowledgement. Different thing. Sometimes better. Afternoon was range time. 500 meters. Zero confirmation. Making sure rifles were sighted properly before pushing distance. Simple. Mechanical. The kind of shooting that separated people who'd practiced from people who'd done it when practice was over and consequences were real. Garrett shot first. Point 3 MOA group. Tight. Professional. Davis went next. Point 4. Torres. Point 5. Others clustered around point 6 to point 8. Good shooting. Not spectacular. Sara's turn. She settled into position. Checked wind. Checked mirage. Sent 5 rounds down range in 90 seconds. Didn't rush. Didn't showboat. Just shot the way she'd been taught to shoot when being taught meant staying alive. Keller measured. Point 5 MOA. Competent. Not dominant. Exactly where she wanted to be. Not showing everything. Not hiding so much it looked like hiding. Threading a needle between two kinds of attention she didn't want. That night, Sara lay in her bunk and thought about the way Keller had looked at her group. The way Briggs had been standing behind the firing line with binoculars even though he didn't need to be there. The way Daniel had been taking notes on a clipboard that probably wasn't recording scores, but something else. This wasn't training. She'd known that since she opened the folder, but now she was starting to understand what it actually was. They were looking for someone, not just someone who could shoot, someone who could shoot and decide and live with both. The question was whether she wanted to be that someone, or whether she'd come here for different reasons, and the answer didn't matter. Because she was already caught in machinery that had started moving before she'd arrived, and wouldn't stop until it had sorted her into whatever category justified bringing her here. Day 2 was distance work, 800 meters, unknown range estimation, wind calling, the skills that separated good shooters from exceptional ones. Sara had been exceptional once, before Kunduz, before she'd learned that exceptional didn't mean infallible, and infallible was the only thing that mattered when other people's lives rode on your math being correct. The morning session was mirage reading. Keller demonstrated, showed them how heat rising from the ground created visible distortion through high magnification optics, how that distortion's direction and speed told you wind conditions at the distance you were observing, how reading mirage at multiple points along a bullet's flight path lets you map wind variation that no anemometer at the firing line could capture. Sara volunteered to call wind at 1,000 meters using mirage alone. She studied the scope for 30 seconds, watched the way the air shimmered above sagebrush in the mid-distance, watched it flow left to right with a speed that translated to velocity if you knew how to translate. 12 to 13 miles per hour, she said. Left to right, gusting slightly every 20 to 30 seconds. Keller checked his instruments. 12.4, gusts at 28 seconds. He looked at her. Where'd you learn that? Hunting. She didn't elaborate. Didn't mention the hundreds of hours she'd spent on Montana ridgelines with her father learning to read one from grass movement, in mirage, in the smell of the air, in the way birds flew when updrafts pushed them higher than they wanted to go. Didn't mention that her father had taught her this before she'd been old enough to understand why it mattered, and by the time she was old enough, it was already instinct. Keller made a note on his clipboard. Sara saw Daniel watching from the rear of the range. His face gave nothing away. It never did. That evening in the classroom, Keller showed footage of historical long-range shots. Carlos Hathcock, Chris Kyle, others whose names were legends and whose shots had become the standard against which all other shots were measured. The last slide was different. Grainy photograph, desert background. A man in marine fatigues holding a rifle with a scope that looked too large for the weapon. "This is Tom Kincaid," Keller said. "Fallujah, 2004. 1,800 meters confirmed. 3 insurgents eliminated with 3 shots in under 90 seconds. Mission success. 23 Marines extracted safely." Sarah's fingers tightened on her pen. She didn't let her face change. Didn't look around to see if anyone was connecting the names. Kincaid wasn't uncommon, could be coincidence. But Daniel was watching her. She could feel it. And in the front row, Colonel Briggs had turned slightly, enough to see her peripheral vision even though he wasn't looking directly at her. They knew, had probably known before she arrived. The question was whether everyone else knew or whether this was a test to see how she'd react to her father's name being used as an example of excellence she'd spent 5 years trying to live up to and 18 months trying to forget. Sarah left the classroom without speaking to anyone, walked to the barracks, pulled out the face-down photograph she'd brought from Montana. 4 people, desert fatigues, her at 22, younger and harder and less haunted. Next to her, Ryan Beck, her spotter, 30 years old, built like he was made from cable and leather. 2 others, Davis and Marsh, whose faces she'd crossed away with black marker 6 months after Kunduz, because looking at them was like looking at an equation that would never balance. She stared at Beck's face. They'd told her he died. Explosion, immediate, nothing anyone could have done. She'd believed them because believing them was easier than asking questions that might have answers she didn't want. Now she wasn't sure what she believed. Daniel had said one of the instructors worked Kunduz, had information. Sarah had assumed it was Daniel, but what if it was someone else? What if Beck had survived? What if everything she'd been told was a lie built on operational necessity and she'd spent 18 months grieving a ghost? She put the photo away, face down, like always. Outside, full dark had settled over the facility. Tomorrow was day 3. More shooting, more evaluation, more pretending she was here for training when everyone in authority knew she was here for something else, and she still didn't know what that something was. Day 3 brought night shooting. The evolution brief came at 1600. Night vision equipment issued. Thermal optics. Targets at 1,200 meters under starlight. The kind of shooting that required trust in equipment and trust in your own ability to translate what you saw through a screen into what existed in 3-dimensional space 1,000 meters away. Most of the shooters struggled. Night vision compressed depth perception, made distance estimation harder, created shadows that weren't there and erased shadows that were. Sarah adapted. She'd done this before. Too many times. Rooftops, ridge lines. That particular valley where she'd provided overwatch for an operation that had gone so wrong that the after-action report was still classified and probably would be until everyone involved was dead. Her father had taught her night shooting, taught her to trust stars instead of moonlight because moonlight lied and stars were too far away to care about human perspective. She remembered his voice. Not the words exactly, just the rhythm, the patience, the absolute certainty that if you paid attention to what was real instead of what looked real, you'd be fine. The target appeared at 1,200 meters, barely visible in starlight, obscured by shadow from a tree line that created a pocket of darkness that swallowed infrared signatures. Instructors gave the command. If you can see it, take it. Nobody fired. Couldn't see the target clearly enough. Too much shadow. Too much interference. Sarah studied her scope for 30 seconds. Didn't look for the target itself. Looked for where the target had to be based on the geometry of the terrain and the way the shadow fell and the small variations in thermal signature that existed even in darkness. She fired once. Impact. Keller's voice on the radio, surprise, evident even though he was trying to hide it. "How the hell did you see that?" Sarah safed her weapon. "I didn't see the target. I saw where it had to be." Keller walked over, stood close enough that she could smell coffee and the particular odor of gun oil that clung to anyone who spent their life around weapons. "Where'd you learn to do that?" Sarah looked at him. "Afghanistan." She didn't elaborate, didn't explain. Walked back to the equipment shed and turned in her night vision gear while around her men were exchanging looks that she pretended not to notice. Daniel found her after the range closed. "Walk with me." It wasn't a request. Sarah followed him along the eastern perimeter away from the barracks toward a maintenance shed that probably hadn't seen maintenance in a decade. "Your father was Tom Kincaid," Daniel said. "Not a question. Statement." Sarah stopped walking. "How'd you know?" "I served with him." "Ramadi, 04, best I ever saw." Pause. "You shoot like him. Same patience." "Don't tell anyone." "Why not?" Because I'm not him. I'm here to do a job, not carry a name. Daniel looked at her for a long moment. Briggs invited you for a reason. This course isn't random. He's looking for someone specific. For what? Above my clearance. Convenient. Daniel almost smiled. The job is real. The selection is real. And whoever gets selected will save lives. But you should know that Briggs is watching you differently than he's watching them. Different metrics, different standards. Because I'm a woman, because you're Tom Kincaid's daughter, and because you survived Kunduz. Sarah's jaw tightened. Survived isn't the word I'd use. You're breathing. 3 others aren't. That's the definition. That's the problem. They stood in the mountain darkness. Somewhere in the valley, an owl called. Another answered. The sound carried in the thin air with a clarity that made distances deceptive. Finally, Sarah spoke. Is Beck alive? Daniel's face did something subtle. Not surprise. Confirmation that she'd figured out something he'd expected her to figure out eventually. Can't answer that. Can't or won't. Both. He walked back toward the barracks, left Sarah standing in the dark with more questions than she'd started with, and the growing certainty that she'd walked into something that had been designed around her specifically, and she'd been too desperate for answers to see the shape of the trap until she was already inside it. Day 4 was stress testing, time pressure, unknown distances, targets that popped up random and gave you 10 seconds to acquire, range, calculate, and engage. The kind of shooting that required muscle memory and decision speed and the ability to separate what mattered from what didn't while your heart rate was spiking and your hands wanted to shake, and the part of your brain that kept you alive was screaming that you were about to make a mistake. Sarah made it through the first 2 targets, hit both, clean. Third target appeared, profile silhouette at 1,100 meters. She acquired it, started her range calculation, and stopped. The silhouette looked like Beck. Same build, same stance. The way he used to stand when he was scanning terrain, weight slightly forward, head tilted just enough to suggest he was listening as much as watching. She hesitated. 2 seconds, maybe 3. Missed. Keller marked it. First miss of the course. Sarah saved her weapon and stepped off the firing line. Around her, other shooters continued. She didn't watch. Stood with her back to the range and breathed the way her therapist had taught her to breathe when the past started feeling more real than the present. After the evolution, medical check. The same doctor who wasn't quite a doctor, Dr. Pierce, same office, same professional concern that felt like being dissected with words instead of scalpels. How are you sleeping? Fine. Lie. Any nightmares? No. Lie. You missed a shot today. First miss of the course. What happened? Wind call was off. Wind was calm. Then I rushed. Dr. Pierce wrote notes. Sarah watched his pen move and knew exactly what he was writing. Subject shows persistent denial of trauma symptoms. Hesitation on target suggests trigger response. Recommend continued observation. You ever hesitate on a shot during service? Everyone hesitates. Even at cost of mission? Especially then. Hesitation means you're thinking. Thinking keeps people alive, or gets them killed if you hesitate too long. Sarah stood up. Are we done? Dr. Pierce looked at her over his reading glasses. Not hostile, not friendly, clinical. Yes, thank you, Miss Kincaid. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. Not unusual. What was unusual was that she couldn't even pretend. She lay in her bunk staring at the ceiling, while around her men breathed in the rhythms of actual sleep or reasonable approximations. At 0200 she gave up, got dressed, walked outside. The facility was quiet. Guard rotation every 4 hours. She knew the pattern by now, had watched it for 3 nights. 2 guards on perimeter, 1 roaming, 1 stationary at the admin building. Gaps in coverage if you knew where to look. She walked along the southern perimeter, keeping to shadows, moving the way she'd been trained to move when being seen meant being dead. Not that she was trying to hide. Not exactly. Just testing, seeing if anyone was watching, seeing if the facility was as secure as it pretended to be. Near the admin building, she heard voices. Low, professional, coming from an office with lights still on at 0230. Sarah stopped, listened. Briggs' voice. How many subjects showing stress markers? Dr. Pierce, 9 out of 15. Kincaid stable enough for now. But when we introduce target files, not provide, introduce. Like they were bringing something into the evaluation that wasn't there yet. Like the course so far had been preliminary and the real test was coming. Briggs, we wait until day 10. Need baseline through full stress battery first. Pierce, and if she refuses when she sees the name, singular, not names. One specific name that they expected Sara to have a reaction to. Briggs. Then we pick number 2. Sara backed away. Quiet. Careful. Got distance between herself and that office and the conversation she wasn't supposed to hear. Her heart was racing. Not from exertion, from understanding. This wasn't a training course. It was an evaluation. They were selecting someone for an operation that required specific skills and specific psychological stability and specific willingness to do something that involved names that would provoke reactions. And they were worried about her reaction to a specific name, Beck. Had to be. They thought Beck was alive, thought he was involved in whatever operation they were planning, and they were evaluating whether Sara could handle knowing that. She walked back to the barracks, lay in her bunk, didn't sleep, watched the ceiling turn from black to gray as dawn approached. Day 5 started with the understanding that everything so far had been prologue. Sara confronted Daniel after breakfast, found him near the equipment shed, alone. This isn't a course. You're evaluating us for an operation. Daniel didn't deny it. Yes. Why lie? Because if you knew from start, you'd perform differently. We needed authentic baseline. Baseline for what? Can't tell you yet. Then I'm out. She started to walk. Daniel's voice stopped her. Kunduz intel you wanted? It's in the target file. The person who can answer what really happened? He's one of 3 targets for the operation. You walk now, you never know what happened that day. Sara stopped, turned. Who? Can't say until day 10. Final evaluation. If you make it, you get full brief, including Kunduz answers. And if I don't make it, you go home. No answers, no operation, no closure. Sara stared at him. This was the trap. She'd known there was a trap. Had known since Daniel showed up at her cabin with his folder and his promises. But knowing about the trap didn't mean she could avoid it. Not when the bait was the one thing she'd been chasing for 18 months. How do I know you're not lying? You don't. But you know I served with your father. Know I was at Ramadi when he made that shot Keller showed everyone. Know I held him after the IED that ended his career. I don't lie to Tom Kincaid's daughter, not about this. Sara wanted to walk away, wanted to get in her truck and drive back to Montana and let whatever happened here happen without her. But she couldn't, because Daniel was right. She didn't know if he was lying, but she knew she'd never forgive herself for not finding out. She stayed. That night, Jake Torres found her on the barrack steps. Can't sleep? Thinking. About? Whether staying here is a mistake. You thinking of quitting? Thinking I'm being used. Torres sat down next to her, close enough for conversation, far enough to respect personal space. Welcome to the military. We're all being used. Question is for what? If it's worth it, being used doesn't matter. What if you don't know what it's for yet? Then you decide if you trust the people using you. Silence. Wind moved through the valley. Sara thought about trust. About her father who trusted bad intel and paid for it. About 3 operators who trusted her intel confirmation and died for it. About whether trust was a currency she still had enough of to spend. I don't trust anyone here, she said. Smart. Neither do I. But I'm still here. Know why? Why? Because if I leave, someone less careful gets selected, and then people die. Sara looked at him. Torres was serious, not trying to convince her, just stating fact. What makes you think people won't die anyway? They might, but at least if I'm there, they'll die because the mission was impossible, not because the person running it was careless. He stood up, walked back inside, left Sara sitting in the dark with the weight of that logic pressing against her chest like altitude sickness. She looked at the mountains, looked at the stars that didn't care about human problems, thought about her father's voice, about Beck's face, about 3 operators whose names she couldn't say out loud anymore. Then she stood up and walked inside. Tomorrow was day 6, halfway through the evaluation, the day when, according to what she'd overheard, they'd start pushing harder. Start separating people who could shoot from people who could shoot and decide and live with the consequences. Sara lay in her bunk and stared at the ceiling and thought about what it meant to live with consequences when the consequences were measured in lives instead of metrics. No answer came. Morning did. And with morning day 6, and the understanding that whatever came next would be harder than anything that had come before. Because the easy part was over. The part where you proved you could shoot. Now came the part where you proved you could choose what to shoot and who to become after you pulled the trigger. Sara closed her eyes, didn't sleep, waited for dawn with the patience her father had taught her and the fear that Kunduz had earned her, and the knowledge that somewhere in this facility, Someone had answers she'd been chasing for 18 months. All she had to do was survive long enough to hear them. The wind picked up outside, sounded like distant thunder, sounded like rotor blades, sounded like the past catching up to the present in a mountain valley where 15 shooters slept and one stayed awake counting the seconds until whatever came next started, whether she was ready or not. Day 6 began with distance that turned the familiar into the impossible. Colonel Briggs stood at the briefing table with a map that showed elevation lines stacked so close together they looked like fingerprints pressed into paper. Behind him, the morning sun turned the eastern ridge gold and made the valley shadows deeper than they should have been. Today through day 8, he said, extreme range qualification, 1,800 meters, 2,400, 3,000, weather dependent, real-world conditions, no do-overs. He looked at each shooter in turn. His eyes lingered on Sara half a second longer than the others. Not judgment, assessment. The kind of look that said he was measuring something invisible, and the measurement mattered more than anything visible ever could. Performance here determines final ranking. Your placement in this course, your consideration for selection. He dismissed them. 15 shooters walked toward the equipment shed. Sara walked slower than the others. Let them get ahead. She was thinking about the distances Briggs had listed, thinking about how those specific ranges weren't random. 1,800 was the distance her father had made his famous shot in Fallujah. 2,400 was the outer limit of what most precision rifle systems could manage with consistency. 3,000 was mythical, the kind of distance that required perfect conditions and perfect execution, and the absolute certainty that you'd done the math correctly because at 3,000 meters, a single degree of scope adjustment moved the point of impact 4 feet. These weren't training distances. These were operational distances. Proof of concept ranges for a mission that required shooting at ranges where most people couldn't even see the target clearly enough to know what they were aiming at. The equipment shed smelled like gun oil in the particular metallic scent of ammunition that had been stored in desert heat and mountain cold and carried the memory of both. Sara drew her rifle, checked the action, loaded her kit with the methodical precision of someone who'd learned that forgetting a single item at the range meant walking back while everyone watched and remembering that walk forever. Jake Torres was checking his gear 2 stations over. He caught her eye, nodded once. Sara nodded back. They hadn't spoken since their conversation on the barrack steps. Didn't need to. Some understandings didn't require words. The first firing position was a natural bench on the valley's eastern rim. Solid rock, good stability. Wind coming up the valley from the south, steady at 15 to 20 miles per hour with gusts that made the flags snap like rifle shots. 1,800 meters. The target was a standard PSC silhouette mounted on a berm that had been painted white to make impacts visible from the firing line. Through her scope, Sara could see previous impacts scattered across the berm like a constellation that told the story of wind calls gone wrong and calculations that had been close but not close enough. Garrett shot first. He was built like violence concentrated into human form. All shoulders and confidence, and the kind of certainty that came from a decade of being told he was elite among the already elite. He settled into position with theatrical precision, made a show of checking his scope, checking his dope card, making minute adjustments that probably didn't need making but demonstrated that he knew what he was doing. He fired. The spotters called it. 4 meters left. Overcorrection on wind. Garrett stood up, didn't acknowledge the miss, walked off the firing line like the earth had rotated wrong and thrown his bullet off target through no fault of his own. Davis went next. Army Ranger, lean and quiet and the kind of dangerous that didn't need to announce itself. His shot landed 2 meters low. Good wind call, wrong elevation data, or wrong calculation of the ballistic coefficient. At this distance, small errors in either meant large misses. 5 more shooters. Results clustered between 2 and 6 meters from center. Professional shooting, not exceptional. The kind of performance that kept you employed but didn't get you selected for missions where missing wasn't an option because options only existed for people who hit. Sara's turn. She settled into position, checked her bubble level, confirmed the rifle was perfectly horizontal because at this distance, a single degree of cant would throw the shot half a meter off target. She studied the mirage, not just at the firing line, at multiple points downrange. 800 meters out, the mirage was moving slightly faster than at the line. Wind acceleration zone. The valley geometry was compressing the wind, speeding it up, creating the conditions that weren't visible from where she was shooting, but would affect the bullet for a third of its flight. Torres was spotting for her. He'd drawn the assignment without asking for it. Good sign, meant he wanted to see how she worked. Call when ready, he said. Wind 15 gusting 20. Left to right. Acceleration zone at 800. Effective wind load is higher than line reading. How much higher? 2 to 3 miles per hour. She made her adjustment, not just for the measured wind at the firing line, for the wind the bullet would encounter along its entire flight path, for the reality that existed between here and there, instead of the illusion that existed only here. She breathed, settled into the respiratory pause where the body was calm and the thoracic muscles relaxed and the world compressed into crosshairs and target and the calculation that connected them. The shot broke clean, recoil, recovery. Through the scope, she watched for impact. Torres, watching through the spotting scope, was silent for a beat. Then, impact. 30 centimeters left of center. Hit. First hit of the day at 1,800 meters. Sara safed her weapon and stood. Didn't celebrate, didn't acknowledge the looks from other shooters. Just stepped off the line and walked to the rear of the range, where Daniel was standing with his clipboard and his measuring look. You adjusted for valley wind, Daniel said. Not question, statement. Yes. Where'd you learn that? Same place I learned everything else. Montana? Afghanistan? She didn't elaborate. Daniel knew the stories, had probably read the after-action reports from the operations Sara had worked, knew that learning happened fastest when the cost of not learning was measured in casualties. The day wore on. By 1,600 hours, only 3 shooters had managed hits at 1,800 meters. Sara, Torres, and a Marine Scout sniper named Rivera, who'd been so quiet for the first 5 days that Sara had almost forgotten he existed. Good trait in a sniper. Invisibility when invisibility mattered. Day 7 brought 2,400 meters in weather that made Day 6 look generous. Overcast, wind gusting to 30, temperature dropping with a front that was pushing down from the north and carrying the promise of snow that might arrive tonight or might wait until tomorrow, but would definitely arrive and change everything when it did. Briggs gave them the option to postpone. Nobody took it. Postponing meant weakness. Weakness meant going home. Going home meant never knowing what the selection was for and whether you'd been good enough to get it. The target at 2,400 looked like a mathematical concept more than a physical object. Through the scope, with maximum magnification, Sara could see it. Barely. A dark rectangle against pale earth. No detail, no definition. Just geometry and faith that the geometry was still there when the bullet arrived 5 seconds after leaving the barrel. Torres shot first this time. Rotation system, alphabetical by call sign. The wind at the firing line was inconsistent, gusting every 20 to 40 seconds. No pattern, no predictability. The kind of wind that made shooting a gamble where the house always won and the best you could hope for was to lose less badly than everyone else. Torres studied conditions for 2 minutes, made his calculations, fired. Miss, 6 meters right. Bad timing. He'd fired into a gust. 4 more shooters, all misses. The closest was 4 meters low. Wind wasn't the problem for that one. Bullet drop calculation was. At 2,400 meters, the bullet was dropping 40 feet from boreline to impact. 40 feet. A 4-story building. The human brain wasn't wired to conceptualize throwing something that far and having it drop that much and still hit a target the size of a refrigerator. Garrett refused to shoot. Conditions are abort-worthy, he said. This is unrealistic. Briggs looked at him. These conditions are operational. If they're abort-worthy, you're telling me you'd abort a mission with American lives at stake because the weather isn't cooperating. Garrett's jaw tightened. He didn't answer. Didn't shoot. Walked off the range. 3 shooters remained. Sara, Rivera, Davis. Davis shot. Hit. 7 meters from center, but technically a hit. Briggs marked it. Davis nodded once and stepped away. Rivera shot. Miss, 2 meters low. Sara's turn. She'd been watching the mirage for 15 minutes. Watching the way it moved, the way it stuttered, the way it created patterns that weren't patterns, but were predictable enough if you watched long enough. The wind wasn't consistent, but it was cycling, gusting for 30 seconds, dropping to calm for 15, gusting again. The cycle wasn't perfect, but it was there. She waited, watched. The gust came, lasted 28 seconds, died, and she had 15 seconds before the next gust. Torres was spotting again. He didn't say anything, didn't ask if she was ready, knew she'd shoot when she was ready, and asking would just be noise. Sara fired into the calm. The bullet flew. 5 seconds of flight time. 5 seconds where physics and mathematics and faith collided and produced an outcome that existed nowhere except at the intersection of barrel and target 2,400 meters apart. Impact. Torres' voice flat was something that might have been surprise or might have been respect. Hit, 1 meter left of center. Sara safed the weapon. Stood. Her hands were steady. Her heart rate was elevated, but not racing. She felt calm. The kind of calm that came after doing something difficult and doing it correctly. Briggs was watching her. So was Daniel. So was Dr. Pierce, the medical evaluator who wasn't quite a doctor, standing at the rear of the range with a tablet that was probably recording observations about stress responses and decision-making under pressure. That night in the barracks, Garrett wouldn't look at her. Torres did, nodded, said nothing. Sara lay in her bunk and thought about distances, about how far 2,400 meters was, about how her father's record had been 1,800 and she'd just beaten it by 600 meters and he was dead and couldn't know and wouldn't care because he'd taught her to shoot better than him, and that was the point. She didn't sleep well. Nobody did. The front arrived at midnight with snow that turned the world white and silent and made morning feel like waking up in a different country. Day 8 began with Briggs announcing a change. Weathers closed the range. No extreme distance shooting today. Instead, night evolution. Perimeter patrol, 4-hour shifts, simulated guard duty. Any intruder detected, call it in. Do not engage without authorization. He let that sink in. This is a test of discipline, of following orders when following orders might feel wrong. Understood? 15 voices acknowledged. Sara's was one of them. The assignments were posted. Sara drew graveyard shift, 0200 to 0600, the shift where nothing happened unless something was wrong. She spent the evening checking gear. Night vision, radio, sidearm with blanks. This was supposed to be training. Blanks were appropriate for training, but Sara had been in enough training exercises that turned real to know that blanks were only appropriate until they weren't. At 0200, she stepped into cold that bit exposed skin and turned breath into fog. The facility was dark, quiet. 2 guards visible at known positions, 1 roaming, 1 stationary at the admin building. She walked the southern perimeter, methodical, professional, the way she'd walked 100 perimeters in a dozen countries where walking wrong meant dying. At 0330, she heard something, not loud, not obvious, just wrong. A sound that didn't belong in the catalog of sounds that mountains made at night when humans weren't adding noise to the equation. 200 meters, tree line on the southern edge of the facility boundary. She stopped, keyed her radio. Control, Kincaid, possible movement, Sector 7. Stand by. She waited, watched. The sound came again, closer. 150 meters. A figure emerged from the tree line, male, tactical gear, weapon. Not instructor uniform. She could tell even at this distance with night vision, turning the world green and grainy. Control, armed individual, Sector 7, 150 meters, approaching perimeter. Can you identify? Negative? Unknown. The voice on the radio hesitated. Just a beat. Just long enough for Sara to understand that whoever was on control watch hadn't been briefed about this scenario, or was pretending they hadn't been briefed to see how she'd react. Hold position. QRF en route. The figure reached the fence, pulled out wire cutters, started cutting. Sara's heart rate spiked. This wasn't training. Training didn't involve cutting actual perimeter fence. Training involved simulated breaches in controlled scenarios where everyone knew the script. Control intruders cutting perimeter fence. Do not engage. Wait for QRF. The fence parted. The figure climbed through, started moving toward the admin building, the building where classified files were stored, where course rosters and selection criteria and whatever operational planning drove this entire evaluation lived in filing cabinets behind locked doors. Control, intruder inside perimeter, heading toward Alpha building. Kincaid, stand down. QRF is 3 minutes out. 3 minutes. Sara watched the figure move, watched him reach the admin building door, watched him pull something from his pack. Small, blocky, could be a breaching charge, could be a training simulator. From this distance, she couldn't tell. He placed it on the door, started setting it. Sara made a decision. She moved parallel to the intruder's position, used shadows, used terrain, closed the distance from 150 meters to 40. Close enough to see details. Close enough to see that the device on the door had wires and a visible timer counting down from 60 seconds. She keyed the radio. Control, intruder has placed device on Alpha building. Timer active. Kincaid, do not engage. That's a direct order. Device is live. QRF won't arrive in time. She didn't wait for response. Raised her rifle. Not the training rifle with blanks. Her actual rifle. The one she'd brought from Montana. The one that fired real ammunition because she'd learned a long time ago that going somewhere dangerous without real ammunition was how you ended up dead while holding a weapon that couldn't save you. She aimed. Center mass was body armor. Shoulder was the target. Disable without killing. Drop him before he could detonate whatever was on that door. She fired. Suppressed shot. Quiet enough that the sound didn't carry beyond 100 meters. Loud enough that the intruder heard it half a second before the impact spun him sideways and put him on the ground. She keyed the radio. Intruder down. Sector 7. Alpha building entrance. 30 seconds later, lights everywhere. Armed guards swarming. Briggs arriving at a run. Daniel right behind him. The QRF team that had supposedly been en route appearing from positions that suggested they'd been staged closer than 3 minutes away. Briggs reached the intruder first. Checked him. Shoulder wound. Non-lethal. Bleeding but not critically. The device on the door was examined by an EOD tech who appeared with tools and certainty. Training simulator, the tech said. Wouldn't have detonated. Wouldn't have done anything except make noise and smoke. Briggs looked at Sara. His face was unreadable. You were ordered to stand down. You ordered me to wait for QRF. QRF was 3 minutes out. He had 30 seconds to detonate. It was a simulator. In tactical gear, cutting actual perimeter fence, placing an actual device with an actual timer. If this was training, your training is indistinguishable from real assault, which means my response was appropriate. Briggs stared at her, the kind of stare that was measuring things that couldn't be measured with instruments. Your job was to wait. My job is to protect this facility. I did. You're welcome. Sara walked away. Didn't wait for dismissal. She'd already been dismissed from whatever test this was. Either she'd passed by shooting or failed by disobeying. Either way, standing there pretending to be sorry wasn't going to change the outcome. In the admin building, lights were on in Briggs' office. Sara could see silhouettes. Briggs, Daniel, Dr. Pierce, arguing or discussing or evaluating. She didn't care which. She went back to the barracks, stripped her gear, lay in her bunk. Around her, men pretended to sleep, probably listening, probably wondering if she'd just ended her chance at selection or guaranteed it. Morning brought answers. Briggs found her at breakfast, pulled her aside. Dr. Pierce wants you removed, says you demonstrated insubordination, clear violation of orders. And you? I think you neutralized a threat. Training or not, that person was inside the perimeter, at a secure building placing a device. You made a call, right or wrong, you made it decisively. So I'm staying? You're staying. But understand something. The operation we're selecting for, the people who get selected, they'll face situations where orders don't match reality, where intel is wrong or incomplete or deliberately misleading. We need people who can think, but we also need people who won't become a liability because they think too much. Which am I? That's what the next 6 days will tell us. He walked away, left Sara standing in morning cold with the understanding that she'd passed something and failed something, and neither mattered as much as what came next. Day 9 brought clear skies and the announcement everyone had been waiting for. Ghost shot, Briggs said. 3,000 meters, 1 attempt each. 0 confirmed hits in facility history at this range. Weather is optimal. This is your chance. He paused. Operational relevance is direct. If selected, you'll be required to engage targets at 3,200 meters. This proves you can do it. Sara asked the question everyone was thinking. And if we can't, then someone else gets selected, and you go home without answers about why you were here. The setup took an hour. Valley range, target 3,000 meters south. The distance was so great that from the firing line, even with maximum magnification, the target looked like a dark smudge against the berm. Like a mistake in the landscape instead of something intentionally placed. 8 shooters remained. The others had been eliminated by cumulative performance or by voluntary withdrawal. Garrett had withdrawn after day 7, claiming injury that nobody believed but nobody challenged, because challenging would mean acknowledging he'd quit. The wind was moderate, 15 miles per hour, steady direction, temperature was 40 degrees, clear sky. These were optimal conditions. The kind of conditions that existed in planning rooms and never in actual operations, but were necessary to prove concept before attempting it in reality. Procedure was simple. Each shooter got one attempt, spotter of their choice. Time limit of 15 minutes to make calculations, set up, and engage. Torres shot first. He was leading the cumulative rankings, 3 for 3, on hits at extreme range. His confidence was earned. He settled into position, made his calculations, visible concentration. The kind of focus that made the world disappear except for the variables that mattered. He fired, long seconds of flight time, spotters watching, silence except wind. Miss, 5 meters left. Torres stood, didn't show frustration. Professional to the core, but Sara saw the tightness around his eyes. The recognition that being 5 meters off at 3,000 meters meant your calculations were close but not close enough, and close didn't count in selections. Davis shot next, 8 meters right. Rivera, 6 meters low. 3 more. All misses. The best was 4 meters from center. Everyone was close. Nobody was hitting. The math was hard. The conditions were optimal, but optimal didn't mean easy. It meant possible. Different thing. Sara was last. She'd requested Torres as spotter. He'd agreed without hesitation. They walked to the firing line together. Sara set up slowly, methodical. She wasn't rushing. 15 minutes was more than enough time if you knew what you were doing, not enough if you didn't. She pulled out her dope card, handwritten, worn, the card she'd been building since she was 19 years old. Entries that went out past 4,000 meters because she'd practiced at distances that most people would never attempt. Not because she enjoyed it, because her father had taught her that practice beyond what you needed meant you'd never face anything you weren't prepared for. Torres looked at the card, didn't say anything, but his eyes widened slightly at the distances listed, at the level of detail, at the corrections for variables that most shooters didn't even know existed. You've shot this distance before, he said. Not this rifle, but yes. Sara studied the valley, not just the target, the entire space between here and there. She stood, walked forward along the eastern edge of the range, studying, reading. Torres followed without asking why. She was looking at the terrain between here and there, the scrub pine at 800 meters, the sage in the open section, the heat mirage above the pale basin floor where the target sat. What she was doing had a formal name in long-range marksmanship, environmental reading. The skill that separated people who could shoot from people who could hit at distances, where hitting required understanding that the air wasn't uniform and the wind wasn't consistent, and every assumption you made about conditions at the firing line was probably wrong by the time the bullet reached the target. She watched the mirage. Through her scope, at high magnification, she could see it flowing. Left to right, speed that indicated wind velocity, direction that confirmed what the flags were saying. But more importantly, she could see variations. At 1,600 meters, the mirage was moving slightly faster. Valley compression effect. The walls were funneling the wind, accelerating it, creating conditions that existed nowhere except in that specific zone. She made notes. Mental, not written. The numbers would come later. Back at the firing line, she settled into position. Torres beside her with the spotting scope. Ready when you are, he said. Sara breathed, slow, controlled. At this altitude, oxygen was 77% of sea level. Managing the respiratory pause without creating hand tremor from oxygen deprivation was part of the challenge. She'd trained at altitude, knew how her body worked when air was thin. She calculated, bullet drop at 3,000 meters, approximately 42 feet, more than the height of a 3-story building. Wind drift, 14 feet right, but that was for consistent wind. The acceleration zone at 1,600 meters changed that. Effective drift was closer to 16 feet. Coriolis effect, the Earth's rotation. At this latitude, firing in a northward direction, the bullet would drift 8 inches right independent of wind. Small but cumulative. Spin drift, the bullet's rotation creating a tendency to drift in the direction of the twist. 5 inches right. She dialed her scope. Elevation, windage. The turrets clicked with mechanical precision. Each click was 1/4 minute of angle. Each click moved the point of impact by specific, calculable amounts. She settled into a respiratory pause, watched the mirage, not just at the target, at the acceleration zone, at the transition points where the wind changed character. She waited. The mirage showed a pattern, not consistent, but there, gusting for 20 seconds, calm for 12, gusting again. A gust came. Sara watched it flow through the mirage like a visible river, watched it die. The calm window opened. She fired. 5 seconds of flight. Physics and math and faith compressed into the arc of a bullet, traveling faster than sound through air that pushed and pulled and tried to move it away from the path it wanted to travel. Torres watched through the spotting scope, didn't breathe. Behind them on the observation line, Briggs and Daniel and Dr. Pierce were watching through their own optics. Nobody spoke. Impact. Torres' voice was strange, flat, the way voices got when the brain was processing information it hadn't predicted. Center mass, 3,000 meters confirmed. Silence. Total. The kind of silence that followed when something impossible stopped being impossible and became real, and everyone who'd thought it was impossible had to recalculate their understanding of what was possible. Sara safed her weapon, stood, didn't celebrate, didn't acknowledge the moment. She'd made the shot because the conditions were right and her calculations were correct, and she'd waited for the window that existed. Nothing more complicated than that. Briggs walked toward her, slowly, like he was approaching something that might disappear if he moved too fast. He carried a clipboard, looked at it, looked at the distant target, looked back at the clipboard like the papers might explain what had just happened. When he reached her, he spoke quietly. First, confirmed hit in facility history at 3,000 meters, on first attempt. Sara said nothing. Your father's record was 1,800. You just beat it by 1,200. Still nothing. Because what was there to say? That she'd spent 10 years learning to do this? That her father had taught her, and she'd practiced, and now she could do it, and his being dead didn't change that? Briggs looked at her for another moment. Then he said something she hadn't expected. Selection brief tonight, 1,800 hours. My office. You're invited. Sara's heart rate, which had been elevated during the shot, spiked higher now. Selection brief. Not if you're selected. You're invited. Meaning the decision was made. Meaning the last 9 days had been confirmation of something they had already decided before she arrived. The question was what they decided and whether she wanted it. That evening, Sara sat in her bunk and thought about the shot. Thought about the math. Thought about her father's voice teaching her to read when she was 12 years old, and how that voice was gone, but the skills remained, and whether skills were legacy enough, or if legacy required something more. Torres found her before the brief. You made history today. I made a shot. Same thing at that distance. Sara looked at him. Torres was serious, not trying to flatter, just stating fact. What do you think the selection is for? She asked. Torres was quiet for a moment, then, something that requires shooting at distances where missing means people die. Something classified enough that they can't tell us until we're selected. Something dangerous enough that they need to make sure we can handle it psychologically before they tell us what it is. That's a lot of assumptions. It's a lot of evidence. 9 days of stress testing. Psych evals disguised as medical checks. Scenarios designed to see if we'll follow orders or break them when orders seem wrong. This isn't training, it's vetting. Sara thought about that. Thought about the intruder she'd shot. Thought about the way Briggs had looked at her after. Not angry, evaluating. If you're selected, Torres said, whatever they ask you to do, make sure it's something you can live with after, because you'll be living with it long after the mission's over. He walked away, left Sara thinking about living with things, about Kunduz, about 3 operators who weren't living with anything anymore. At 1,800 hours, she walked to Briggs's office. The door was open. Inside, Briggs, Daniel, Dr. Pierce, and someone new. A woman, 2 stars on her shoulders, general's insignia, late 50s, gray hair pulled into a regulation bun, face that had seen combat and command and hadn't flinched from either. Briggs gestured for Sara to sit. She sat. General Hastings, Briggs said, CIA Operations Division. The general looked at Sara the way surgeons looked at patients before making the first incision. Assessing, planning, already seeing past the surface to whatever needed to be fixed or removed. Miss Kincaid, the general said, congratulations on your performance, particularly the 3,000-meter shot. Exceptional work. Thank you. You're wondering why you're here? Yes, because 9 days ago, Colonel Briggs sent me your file. Former Marine Scout sniper. 4 deployments. 23 confirmed eliminations in combat. Kunduz incident in 2023. Early separation, PTSD diagnosis. Current employment as hunting guide in Montana. Sarah's jaw tightened. They'd known everything before she arrived. Daniel's recruitment hadn't been about giving her a chance. It had been about confirming she still had the skills they needed and determining whether she was stable enough to use them. Your file also shows something else, Hastings continued. Your father was Tom Kincaid, Medal of Honor recipient, one of the finest precision shooters the Marine Corps ever produced. You've spent your entire career trying to prove you're not just his daughter, that you earned your place. Sarah said nothing, because that was true and denying it would be lying, and lying to a two-star general seemed unwise. Hastings pulled out a folder, tan, unmarked, the kind of folder that contained operations that didn't exist on paper except in folders exactly like this one. Operation Nightfall, she said. Classified at the highest level, ongoing for 8 months. Problem that requires a very specific skill set to solve. She opened the folder. Inside, photographs, satellite imagery, dense text that Sarah couldn't read from across the desk. 3 targets, all former U.S. intelligence assets, all compromised, all currently selling classified information to hostile states. Location confirmed, border facility, Syria, Iraq border, 40 kilometers from Turkish boundary. Targets meet every 14 days to exchange intelligence. Next meeting in 72 hours. Hastings pulled out 3 photographs, set them on the desk facing Sarah. Window is 4 minutes. Guard rotation creates brief isolation of meeting location. Your mission would be eliminate all 3 targets from Overwatch position at 3,200 meters. Headshots only. They wear body armor. No misses. Extraction team recovers bodies for confirmation. Sarah looked at the photographs. Didn't pick them up yet. Didn't want to see the faces until she'd decided whether she was going to accept this. Why me? Because you're the only person we found who can consistently hit at this range. Because you're not active duty, which gives us plausible deniability if this goes wrong. Because your psych eval shows you're stable enough to function, but damaged enough that you won't ask too many questions about why these people need to die. Hastings let that sit for a moment. Sarah felt the words land like punches. Damaged enough. Like her trauma was a job qualification instead of something that woke her up at 3 in the morning. You have 12 hours to decide, Hastings said. Accept or decline. If you decline, we offer it to Torres. He's qualified, no emotional complications. But he doesn't have your range. He'd need to get closer. Closer means higher risk of compromise. Sarah reached for the photographs, picked them up, looked at the faces. First photo, Anatoly Volkov, former CIA contractor, Russian national, face like stone weathered by decades of lies. She didn't recognize him. Second photo, Malcolm Cross, former NSA analyst, American, soft features, accountant's face, the kind of person who looked harmless until you realized they'd sold secrets that got people killed. She didn't recognize him either. Third photo, Sarah stopped breathing. The face was older, thinner, weathered in ways it hadn't been 3 years ago. But she knew it, knew the angle of the jaw, knew the scar above the left eyebrow from shrapnel and helmet, knew the way the eyes looked slightly different from each other because one had been damaged by blast overpressure and never healed quite right. Ryan Beck, her spotter, her partner, the man they'd told her died in the Kunduz explosion, the man she'd been carrying as a ghost for 18 months. He was alive, and according to this file, he was a traitor. Hastings was watching her. So was Briggs. So was Daniel, waiting for her reaction, measuring it. This was the real test, not the shooting. This. You know him, Hastings said, not question. Statement. Sarah couldn't speak. Her throat was closed. Her hands were shaking. She set the photographs down before anyone could see the tremor. Sergeant First Class Ryan Beck, former Army Special Forces, your spotter for 3 deployments. He was listed as KIA in Kunduz. Revised status, alive, hostile. Intelligence confirms he faked his death, went dark. He's been selling operational details for 3 years. Details that have compromised ongoing missions and gotten current assets killed. That's not possible. Sarah's voice was rough, like she hadn't used it in days. Facial recognition is 96%. Financial transactions traced to his social security number. Dead man using his own social. He's alive. He's operational. He's hostile. Beck wouldn't turn. I know him. General Hastings pulled out more documents. Set them on the desk. Surveillance photos showing a man who looked like Beck meeting with known hostile operators. Bank statements showing deposits to an account with Beck's SSN. Signal intercepts mentioning an American asset. People change, Hastings said. 3 years alone with no support, no contact, watching operations fail around him because the intel he was getting was wrong. That breaks people. We've seen it before. Sara stared at the documents, wanted them to be fake, wanted this to be another test, wanted to wake up in Montana and have this entire facility be a nightmare that dissolved in mountain morning light. Let me hear the voice intercepts. Classified. Convenient. Daniel spoke for the first time. Sara, I know this is hard, but intel is solid. 3 independent sources confirm. Beck is dirty. Or someone's framing him. Set up his SSN. Deepfake the photos. Splice audio. You've done it before. To enemies. Who says someone isn't doing it to him? Hastings' face didn't change. We've considered that possibility. Investigated it. This is real. Beck is alive. Beck is hostile. Beck is selling information that's getting Americans killed. Your mission is to eliminate him and recover the other 2 targets before they can disappear. Sara stood up. Chair scraped against floor. The sound was too loud in the small office. I need to think. You have until 0600 tomorrow. 12 hours. After that, we offer it to Torres. Sara walked out. Didn't wait for dismissal. Walked through the dark facility toward the barracks. The cold, bitter face. She welcomed it. Needed something physical to feel because everything else was breaking apart inside her chest. Beck was alive. The man she'd grieved for 18 months. The man she'd blamed herself for failing to protect. The man whose death had convinced her to leave the Marines because what was the point of staying if you couldn't keep your partner alive? He'd been alive the whole time, and now they wanted her to kill him. She found a bench outside the barracks, sat, stared at mountains that were black shapes against a blacker sky. Stars were out. The same stars that had been out in Kunduz. The same stars that had been out every night she'd lain awake wondering if she could have done something different to save Beck. And he hadn't needed saving. He'd been alive, selling secrets, getting people killed, or being framed, set up, used as a scapegoat for someone else's crimes. She didn't know which, and she had 12 hours to decide whether to take a shot that would end his life without ever knowing the truth. Torres found her an hour later. You're selected. Sara nodded, couldn't speak yet. Torres sat down next to her, close enough for solidarity, far enough to respect the space grief needed. Who's the target, he asked. 3 people. 2 I don't know, 1 I do. Torres was quiet, then, someone from Kunduz? My spotter. They told me he died. He didn't. Now they say he's selling secrets. Wants me to eliminate him. Torres exhaled, long and slow, the sound of someone recognizing impossible situations and knowing there were no good answers. Do you believe them? That he's dirty? I don't know. Evidence looks solid, but evidence can be manufactured. What's your gut say? My gut says Beck was the most loyal person I ever worked with. That he'd die before he'd betray anyone. But my gut also said the intel at Kunduz was solid and 3 operators died because I was wrong. Torres considered that. You have to decide if you trust yourself more than you trust their evidence. Because if you take the shot and you're wrong, you live with it. If you don't take the shot and he's dirty, people die. Either way, you're choosing who lives with the consequences. Sara closed her eyes, thought about Beck's face in that photograph. Older, weathered, but alive. Thought about the way he used to check her calculations before every shot. The way he'd spotted for her when the win was impossible and the targets were at ranges where most spotters couldn't even see what they were supposed to be watching. Thought about how if someone had told Beck that Sara was a traitor and needed to be eliminated, Beck wouldn't have believed it, would have demanded proof, would have verified. She opened her eyes. If I take this mission, I verify before I shoot. If anything in the field contradicts their intel, I abort. I'm not shooting on questionable evidence again. Even if it means mission failure? Even if it means mission failure. Torres nodded, stood, looked down at her with something that might have been respect or might have been pity. Whatever you decide, make sure it's something you can live with, because the shot lasts 1 second. Living with it lasts forever. He walked away. Left Sara sitting in the dark with 12 hours until dawn and a decision that would define everything that came after. She thought about her father, about the shot he'd made in Fallujah, about the 23 Marines who'd lived because he hit, about the Medal of Honor citation that said he'd acted with exceptional valor under fire. What the citation didn't say was that he'd verified the target before shooting, that he'd taken extra seconds. Nobody thought he had to make sure the person in his crosshairs was actually hostile. That verification had delayed his shot by 5 seconds, and 5 seconds at that distance meant the target could have moved and the shot could have failed and 23 Marines could have died. But he'd verified anyway, because shooting the wrong person wasn't valor, it was murder. Sara stood, walked back to the barracks, pulled out her dope card, the worn piece of paper with calculations that went out past 4,000 meters. Thought about all the hours she'd spent building that card, all the practice shots, all the math, all the preparation for a moment that was supposed to mean something. This was that moment, and it didn't mean what she'd thought it would mean. At 0500, she walked to Briggs' office. Dawn was an hour away. The facility was dark except for security lights that turned everything blue and cold. Briggs' light was on. He was already there, drinking coffee, reading reports, preparing for a day that would start with her decision. Sara knocked. He looked up, gestured for her to enter. "You decided." "Yes, I'll take the mission, on one condition." Briggs set his coffee down, leaned back, waited. "I verified target identity before I shoot. If anything in the field contradicts your intel, I abort. Won't shoot on questionable evidence, not again." Mission window is 4 minutes. No time for extended verification. Then the mission fails? "Because I won't shoot Beck or anyone else based on evidence that could be wrong." Briggs stared at her. The silence stretched. Outside, the sky was starting to lighten, gray pushing against black. The color of decisions made without good options. Finally, Briggs spoke. "You're asking me to risk mission failure because you don't trust CIA intelligence. I'm asking you to risk mission failure because I don't trust any intelligence after Kunduz." "Fair." He picked up his phone, dialed, waited. Someone answered. "General Hastings?" "Briggs." "Kincaid's accepted. With condition. She wants verification authority before engagement." He listened. His face didn't change. After 30 seconds, he hung up. "General says fine. You'll have target designator, facial recognition device, point at each target, 5 seconds for confirmation. 3 confirmations required before you're cleared to engage. Any non-match, you report and abort." "Understood?" "Understood." Mission brief is 1400. Full tactical package. Insertion is tomorrow night. Window opens in 48 hours. Sara nodded, turned to leave. Briggs stopped her with a question. "What if the designator confirms it's Beck? What if the evidence is right and he's dirty? Can you take the shot?" Sara looked at him, thought about Beck, about loyalty, about what it meant to trust someone completely and have that trust broken or betrayed or revealed to be misplaced. "If he's dirty," she said, "if the evidence in the field confirms it, then yes, I can take the shot. But if there's doubt, if there's any indication something's wrong, I'm aborting. And you'll have to live with whatever happens next." She walked out. Dawn was coming. The mountains were turning from black to gray to the particular gold that only happened in high country October. In 48 hours, she'd be in a different country, looking through a scope at faces 3,000 meters away. One of those faces might be Ryan Beck, might be a traitor, might be the man she trusted with her life in 4 deployments. And she'd have to decide which, based on a facial recognition device and intel that had been wrong before and might be wrong again. Torres was waiting outside the barracks. "You accepted." "Yes." "What did you decide about verification?" "That I'm not shooting anyone without confirming they're actually who command says they are. Not after Kunduz." Torres nodded, respect in his eyes. "Good, because the easy thing would be following orders. Hard thing is questioning them when they might be wrong." Sara looked at the mountains, thought about hard things, about shots that lasted 1 second and consequences that lasted forever. About fathers who taught daughters to verify before shooting and daughters who had to learn that lesson twice because the first time wasn't enough. She went inside, lay in her bunk, didn't sleep, didn't try, just lay there while the facility woke around her and morning began, and somewhere in Syria, 3 people who didn't know they were targets prepared for a meeting that might be their last. If Sara's verification confirmed they deserved it, and if the verification was wrong, she'd carry another ghost. But at least this time, she'd know she'd tried to make sure before pulling the trigger. The question was whether trying was enough, whether verification mattered when the consequences of being wrong were measured in lives either way, whether there was any moral high ground left when every path led through blood. No answer came. Morning did. And with morning, day 10, and the knowledge that in 36 hours she'd be prone on foreign soil with American targets in her crosshairs, and orders that said shoot and conscience that said verify, and the understanding that whatever she chose, someone would call it wrong, and she'd have to live with it anyway. She closed her eyes, waited for the brief, waited for the moment when theory became mission, and mission became memory, and memory became the thing she'd carry until the day she stopped carrying anything at all. The briefing room at 1400 hours smelled like coffee that had been sitting too long, and the particular tension that preceded operations where people died if you miscalculated. Sara sat at a steel table that had seen 1,000 mission briefs. Briggs stood at the front with satellite imagery projected on a screen that showed terrain and resolution so high you could count rocks on the ground from orbit. Daniel sat to her left, General Hastings to her right, Dr. Pierce in the back corner with his tablet, still evaluating, still measuring, still documenting behaviors that would go into files Sara would never see. Operation Nightfall, Briggs said, classified insertion, 48 hours from now. You deploy alone, no spotter, no backup on site. Extraction support at secondary position 2 kilometers from Overwatch. Mission duration, 6 hours from insertion to exfil. He clicked through imagery, desert terrain, rocky, the kind of landscape that looked like Mars except with the added complication of hostile forces who would kill you if they found you. Target compound, Syria-Iraq border, 40 kilometers from Turkish boundary, 3 buildings, courtyard between. Targets meet in the courtyard. 4-minute window during guard rotation, 04:10 to 04:14 local time. That's your engagement window. Sara studied the imagery. The compound was isolated. Nearest settlement 8 kilometers south. Nearest road 3 kilometers east. Good isolation for the targets. Good isolation for her. Nobody to interfere. Nobody to witness. The kind of place where events happened and nobody reported them because reporting meant acknowledging you'd seen something that powerful people wanted invisible. Your Overwatch position, ridgeline, 3,200 meters north of compound. Natural rock formation provides cover and concealment. Approaches via Wadi system from drop zone 5 kilometers west. Movement time approximately 90 minutes. Setup time 30 minutes. Wait time varies depending on target arrival. More imagery. The ridge where she'd lie prone. The wadi she'd move through. The desert that would either hide her or expose her depending on how carefully she moved and how lucky she was. Equipment. TAC-338 rifle. Suppressed. Thermal optic. Target designator for facial recognition. Daniel Cross will be mission controller from Remote Operations Center. Jake Torres is QRF at secondary position. If compromise occurs, he extracts you. If extraction fails, you're off book. No support, no acknowledgement. Hastings spoke. Her voice was cold, professional. The voice of someone who'd ordered enough operations to know that some of them failed and the people who failed with them became statistics in classified reports. Target Alpha, Anatoly Volkov, former CIA contractor, Russian national, selling signals intelligence to SVR. Confirmed 6 transactions in 8 months. Compromised 3 ongoing operations. 2 assets killed. Target Bravo, Malcolm Cross, former NSA analyst, American, selling cyber access protocols. Confirmed 4 transactions. Compromised infrastructure security. Ongoing damage assessment. Target Charlie, Ryan Beck, former Army Special Forces, your former spotter. Listed KIA Kunduz 2023. Status revised, alive, hostile. Selling operational details from Afghanistan deployments. Confirmed 3 transactions. Asset compromise. 2 operators KIA as direct result of information he provided. Sara's hands were flat on the table. She kept them there so nobody would see if they shook. Beck's name spoken out loud made it real in a way the photograph hadn't, made it something she couldn't pretend wasn't happening. Engagement sequence. Target designator confirms all 3 identities. You're cleared hot only after 3 positive confirmations. Headshots, center mass is body armor. No mistakes. You have 4 minutes, 80 seconds per target. Miss rate tolerance is 0. Briggs looked at Sara. Questions? What if designator fails to confirm? You abort, report. Wait for further instructions. What if it confirms 2, but not the 3rd? You eliminate the 2 confirmed. Abort on the 3rd. Mission is partial success. What if none confirm? Mission failure. You extract. We reassess. Hastings leaned forward. The designator won't fail. It's been tested. 98% accuracy, but your condition stands. You verify before engaging. We've equipped you for that. Use it. Sara nodded. Thought about 98%. Thought about the 2% where the machine was wrong and you shot the wrong person or didn't shoot the right person. And either way, consequences followed that no accuracy rating could predict. The brief continued for another hour. Details about insertion, about weather windows, about contingency procedures if the targets didn't show, or showed early, or showed with additional security that made the shot impossible. About what happened if she was compromised. The answer to that last question was simple and brutal. If compromised, she ran. If captured, she talked, told them everything. Because this operation didn't exist and her capture wouldn't be acknowledged, and torture would extract information anyway, so there was no point in resisting beyond what her training required for the mission to abort cleanly. At 1600, they dismissed her. Sara walked out into afternoon light that felt too bright after 2 hours in a windowless room looking at photographs of people who might die because of decisions she made in 4-minute windows 3,200 meters away. Torres found her near the equipment shed. You ready? No. Good. People who think they're ready for this kind of thing usually aren't. Fear keeps you sharp. Overconfidence gets you killed. Sara looked at him. Torres had been selected as QRF backup, the person who would extract her if everything went wrong. The person who would probably be the last friendly face she saw if wrong meant captured or killed. You've done this before, she said. Not question. Statement. 5 times, 3 successes, 1 partial, 1 failure. What happened on the failure? Shooter hesitated. Target moved. Window closed. Mission abort. 2 weeks later, Target eliminated 3 assets we'd been running for 18 months. Hesitation cost lives. Sara thought about that. Thought about hesitation. About the target she'd missed on day 4 because it looked like Beck. About how hesitation then had been a training problem, but hesitation in 36 hours would be operational failure with consequences measured in bodies. What if I hesitate? Then you abort. Come home. Live with knowing you didn't take the shot, or you don't hesitate. Take the shot. Live with knowing you did. Either way, you're living with something. Question is which something you can carry. He walked away, left Sara standing in mountain cold that felt warm compared to the cold that was coming when she lay prone on a ridge in Syrian desert with American targets in her scope, and orders that said shoot and conscience that said verify. That evening, she packed her gear. Methodical. Everything had a place. Everything went in the same position every time. Rifle case, ammunition, scope, rangefinder, target designator. The small device that would either confirm Beck was a traitor or reveal that the intelligence was wrong, and she was being asked to execute someone for crimes they hadn't committed. She thought about her father, about the mission Daniel had mentioned, the one where her father had verified before shooting and discovered the target was undercover CIA. The one that had ended his career because verification had delayed the shot, and delay had meant mission failure, and failure had meant consequences for everyone except the person who'd been saved by verification. Her father had chosen verification, had paid the price, had died a civilian instead of a Marine because he'd refused to shoot on questionable evidence. Sara was making the same choice, would probably pay a similar price. The question was whether the price was worth paying. When paying, it meant trusting your judgment over institutional intelligence, and trusting judgment meant accepting that you might be wrong, and wrong meant people died anyway. No good answer existed, only choices, and the understanding that choosing was the law and living with choices was the cost. At 2,200 hours, she lay in her bunk and didn't sleep. Around her, men breathed in the rhythms of actual rest. She envied them, envied the ability to close your eyes and trust that tomorrow would come and you'd face it and survive it and the cycle would continue. She couldn't trust that anymore. Hadn't been able to since Kunduz. Since the night when trust and intelligence had gotten 3 men killed and taught her that trust without verification was faith, and faith belonged in churches, not in operations where faith got people killed. At 0400, she gave up pretending, got dressed, walked outside. The facility was dark except for security lights that turned everything blue and made shadows longer than they should be. Daniel found her near the perimeter fence. Couldn't sleep? Didn't try. He stood next to her, not close, respecting space. They looked at mountains that were starting to show definition as dawn approached from behind them. Your father couldn't sleep before operations either, Daniel said. He'd walk, check his gear 5 times. 6, like checking it again would make the mission safer or the shot cleaner or the outcome more certain. Did it help? No, but it gave him something to do with the fear. Sara thought about that, about fear, about how fear was biological and couldn't be controlled but could be channeled, could be used, could become the thing that kept you sharp instead of the thing that made you freeze. What if the designator says Beck is clean, that he's not the traitor? Then you don't shoot him. You shoot the other 2. You report. You let command figure out what happened. And if they order me to shoot him anyway? Daniel was quiet for a long time. Then he said something Sara hadn't expected. Then you decide whether you're a soldier who follows orders or a person who follows conscience. Because sometimes you can't be both. Your father learned that, cost him his career. But he never regretted it, not once, not even at the end. Sara looked at him. He told you that? He told me that dying a civilian who'd saved an innocent was better than living as a Marine who'd executed one. That some prices were worth paying because the alternative was living as someone you didn't recognize when you looked in the mirror. Dawn came, gold light on eastern peaks, the sky turning from black to gray to blue. Sara watched it happen and thought about mirrors, about reflections, about the person she'd been before Kunduz and the person she'd become after, and whether the person she'd be after this mission would be someone she could recognize or someone she'd spend the rest of her life avoiding. Atto 600 final gear check. Briggs and Hastings both present. Daniel handling equipment verification. Everything was there. Everything was correct. The rifle was zeroed. The ammunition was matched to the barrel. The scope was calibrated. The target designator was tested and functional. You're clear for departure, Briggs said. Helo lifts at 1900. Flight time 7 hours. Insertion at 0200 local. Movement to position 90 minutes. Setup 30 minutes. Target window opens 0410. 4 minutes. Questions? None. Good hunting. Sara picked up her gear, walked toward the waiting helicopter. Torres was already there, checking his own equipment. He looked up when she approached, nodded once. No words needed. They both knew what was coming. Both knew that in 12 hours they'd be in foreign territory doing things that their country would deny if asked, and that they'd carry alone if discovered. The flight was long. Sara sat in darkness, broken only by red instrument lights that let pilots see without destroying night vision. The helicopter was a Black Hawk configured for low visibility insertion. No markings, no identification. The kind of aircraft that existed in manifests as training flight, but in reality carried operators to places where operations happen that reports never mentioned. Torres sat across from her, eyes closed, not sleeping, just conserving energy, waiting. Sara did the same, closed her eyes, breathed, let her mind settle into the operational calm that came from accepting what was about to happen and preparing for it without emotion, because emotion was fuel for later when the mission was over and you had time to feel things. They crossed into Syrian airspace at Angels 12, high enough to avoid casual detection, low enough to drop quickly if threat emerged. The pilot's voice came through her headset. 10 minutes. Sara opened her eyes, checked her gear one final time. Everything was where it needed to be. Everything was ready. Now the question was whether she was ready. Whether 18 months of Montana isolation and 9 days of evaluation and 48 hours of preparation had rebuilt whatever had broken in Kunduz. 5 minutes. The helicopter descended. Fast, tactical descent that put them on the ground before radar could track long enough to identify. The insertion zone was a wadi system 6 kilometers from the target compound. Natural cover, rocky terrain. The kind of place where a helicopter could land and lift and leave no trace except rotor wash and sand that wind would erase by morning. 30 seconds. Sara stood, checked her rifle, checked her pack. Torres stood too, made eye contact, nodded. Good luck was unspoken. Luck wasn't something you wish for. It was something that either existed or didn't, and wishing changed nothing. The helicopter touched down. Side door opened. Desert night rushed in with cold and dust and the smell of earth that had never seen rain. Sara stepped out. Torres followed. The helicopter lifted immediately. No delay, no waiting, just insertion and departure and silence. They moved. Sara took point. Torres followed at 5-meter interval. The wadi was deep enough to hide them from observation, narrow enough that movement was channeled. They moved in silence. No talking. Hand signals only. 15 years of training had taught them both how to communicate without words. 90 minutes of movement brought them to the split point. Torres would proceed to secondary position. Sara would continue to overwatch. They stopped. Torres checked his equipment one final time. 4 hours, he said. Window opens 0410. You've got 3 hours to get in position and wait. I'm 2 clicks south if you need extraction. Radio silence and less compromise. Understood? Understood. Torres looked at her. His face was shadowed by starlight. Unreadable. Whatever happens up there, make sure you can live with it. He moved south, disappeared into darkness. Sara was alone. She continued north. Another 40 minutes brought her to the ridge. Natural rock formation, good elevation, good sight lines, good cover from observation. She settled into position, checked range, 3,200 meters to compound courtyard. Perfect. She set up the rifle, bipod extended, bubble level checked, scope mounted and locked. She dialed in her dope. Elevation for 3,200 meters. Windage for current conditions. The adjustments clicked with mechanical precision. Each click was 1/4 minute of angle. Each click moved the point of impact by specific calculable distance. She checked the target designator, small device, mounted to the rifle's top rail. Screen showed green. Ready? Active. She aimed at a rock 30 meters away. Pressed the activation button. Device scanned. Processed. Screen showed. No match. Correct. Rock wasn't a target. Device was working. She settled into wait. Waiting was the hardest part of this job. Harder than the shot. Harder than the movement. Harder than the fear. Waiting meant thinking. Thinking meant remembering. Remembering meant Kunduz. She pushed it away. Focused on breathing. On the night sounds. On the way stars looked in desert air without light pollution. On anything except the 3 faces in her mission folder, and the fact that one of those faces belonged to a man she trusted and grieved and now might have to kill. At 0345, movement at the compound, lights in one building, vehicle approaching from the south. Sara watched through her scope. Thermal imaging showed heat signatures, 3 people in the vehicle. It stopped at the compound entrance. 3 figures emerged, walked toward the courtyard. 0400. Target window would open in 10 minutes. Sara's heart rate elevated, not panic, just biology. The body preparing for action. She controlled her breathing, slowed her heart rate through respiratory control, settled into the calm that came from preparation meeting opportunity. 0405. The 3 figures were in the courtyard now, visible through thermal. She switched to visual magnification, maximum zoom, could see faces now, barely. Just enough to distinguish features. She activated the target designator, aimed at the first figure, adult male, heavy build. The device scanned, processed. Screen showed target match Volkov, confirmed. Target alpha, Anatoly Volkov, Russian contractor. Traitor, verified. She aimed at the second figure, leaner, smaller. Device scanned. Screen showed target match, Cross. Target Bravo, Malcolm Cross, NSA analyst. Traitor, verified. 2 confirmed, 1 remaining. She aimed at the third figure. The device scanned, processed, processing. The screen flickered. Sara's breath caught. No match. She blinked, rechecked her aim. The figure was visible. Clear sightline, good thermal signature. She activated the designator again, scanned again. No match. Sara's heart rate spiked. The third figure was supposed to be Ryan Beck. The intelligence said it was Beck. The photograph showed Beck. The evidence said Beck was here, selling secrets, meeting with confirmed traitors. But the designator said no match. She keyed her radio. Daniel was mission control. Voice came through her headset immediate. Control, Kincaid. Third target, facial recognition, negative, not confirmed. Repeat, last. Third target does not match Beck profile. Designator says no match. Recheck, device may have malfunction. Sara switched to visual maximum magnification. Studied the third figure. Something was wrong. The person was moving differently. Not the confident stride of an operator meeting colleagues. More tentative, checking surroundings constantly. The behavior of someone nervous or someone who didn't want to be there. She switched back to thermal. Enhanced view. Saw something she'd missed before. The third figure's hands. They were positioned wrong, not at sides, not relaxed. Behind back, restrained. Control, third target has hands restrained. Visible restraints. This is not a meeting. Target is prisoner. Negative. Intelligence confirms all three targets are hostile. Designation is confirmed by alternate means. You are cleared hot. Engage. Sarah's breath came faster now. The intelligence was wrong. The third figure wasn't Beck meeting with traitors. The third figure was someone the traitors had brought. Someone who was bound. Someone who was about to be executed. Control, negative. Target is restrained. Behavior indicates hostage, not hostile. I am not engaging without positive identification. Kincaid, you are cleared hot. Window is closing. 90 seconds remaining. Engage now or abort. Sarah made a decision. The kind of decision that defined careers and lives and the person you became after the mission ended. Engaging confirmed targets only, Alpha and Bravo. Charlie is abort pending verification. She aimed at Volkov. Center mass was body armor. Headshot required. She controlled her breathing, settled into a respiratory pause. The world compressed into crosshairs and target and mathematics. She fired 3,200 meters, 5 seconds of flight. The bullet traveled through night air that pushed and pulled and tried to move it off trajectory. Sarah had calculated for everything. Wind, gravity, Coriolis, spin drift. The bullet arrived where she'd sent it. Volkov dropped. Clean hit, confirmed. The compound erupted. Guards running. Cross-drawing weapon. The third figure trying to move, still restrained. Sarah aimed at Cross. He was turning toward the building, trying to escape. She led him, calculated his movement. Fired. Impact. Cross dropped. 2 confirmed kills. Mission partially successful. The third figure was running now. Restrained but running. Guards closing from 2 directions. Sarah had maybe 10 seconds before guards reached the figure, and whatever happened next wasn't something she could affect from 3,200 meters. She made another decision. Aimed at the guards. Not kill shots. Leg shots. Disable without executing. She fired 3 times in rapid succession. Training taking over. Muscle memory. The kind of shooting that happened faster than conscious thought. 3 guards dropped. Leg hits, non-lethal. Screaming, alive but no longer pursuing. The third figure reached the perimeter wall. Climbed, fell, got up, kept running toward the desert north of the compound. Sarah switched to maximum thermal magnification. Focused on the figure's face. Now that distance was closer and angle was better, she could see features. Older than in the photographs. Thinner. Face showing signs of prolonged stress or captivity. But the bone structure was right. The build was right. The way the person moved, even while injured, was right. It was Beck. Ryan Beck, her former spotter, alive. Not meeting with traitors. Being held by them. About to be executed. Sarah keyed her radio. Control. Charlie is Beck. Confirmed visual identification. He was hostage, not hostile. Volkov and Cross were executing him. I engaged primary targets, disabled guards. Subject is extracting on foot toward my position. Requesting QRF for pickup. Daniel's voice came back. Strained, talking to someone else off mic. Then back to her. Negative on QRF. You are not authorized to extract unconfirmed friendly. Abort and extract yourself. Immediate. Subject is Beck. He was my spotter. He's alive. He's injured. He's in hostile territory. I am not leaving him. Kincaid, you are ordered to abort. Extract to secondary. Torres will pick you up. Do not engage further. Sarah ignored the radio, switched it off, started breaking down her position. Rifle disassembled. Packed. Scope secured. She moved down from the ridge toward the direction Beck was running. Night vision showed him, 800 meters south, moving slowly, injured or exhausted or both. She reached him in 10 minutes. He was on the ground, breathing hard, hands still bound behind him, face covered in dust and blood, and the kind of exhaustion that came from months of captivity. Sarah approached carefully. He might not recognize her, might think she was hostile. She kept her rifle lowered but ready. Beck, it's Kincaid, you're safe. He looked up. Eyes that had seen too much. Face that was older than it should be after 3 years. He stared at her like she was a ghost. Kincaid? You're dead. They told me everyone from Kunduz was KIA. Told me I was the only one left. Sara cut his restraints with her knife, helped him stand. He could barely walk. Malnutrition, injuries, time. How long have they had you? 3 years, since Kunduz. They grabbed me after the explosion, faked my death, kept me alive because I knew operational details they could sell. Told me everyone else was dead so I'd cooperate. Sara's jaw tightened. 3 years. Beck had been captive for 3 years, believing his entire team was dead and that nobody was coming for him because nobody knew he existed. Did you sell information? Never. They tried. I gave them nothing, so they beat me, starved me, told me they'd execute me once they didn't need me anymore. Tonight was supposed to be that execution. Sara keyed her radio back on. Torres answered immediately. Kincaid, where are you? Command is losing their minds. En route to secondary with Beck. He was hostage, not hostile. I'm extracting him. Torres didn't argue, didn't question, just Ite, 20 minutes, be ready. They moved. Beck leaning on Sara, moving slowly. Behind them, the compound was chaos. Lights, vehicles, but nobody pursuing yet. They had time, not much, but enough. Torres met them at the secondary position with an all-terrain vehicle he'd somehow acquired. Didn't ask how, didn't care. They loaded Beck in the back. Sara climbed in front. Torres drove without headlights, using night vision, pushing the vehicle faster than was safe across terrain that could kill them if they hit the wrong rock wrong. 40 minutes later, they reached the emergency extraction point. Torres had called it in. A helicopter was inbound. Not the planned extraction, emergency protocol. The kind that got used when missions went wrong and people needed to disappear fast before hostile forces organized responses. The helicopter landed. They loaded Beck aboard. Sara and Torres followed. The bird lifted immediately, gaining altitude fast, getting distance from hostile territory before anyone could organize pursuit or air defense. In the helicopter, Sara finally had time to think about what she'd done. She disobeyed direct orders, shot guards that weren't authorized targets, extracted a person without permission, compromised the mission profile, violated operational security. She'd also saved an innocent man from execution, eliminated 2 confirmed traitors, proven the intelligence was wrong. The question was which mattered more, to command, to her career, to the person she saw in the mirror. Beck was unconscious in the back. Medics were working on him. Torres sat across from Sara. His face was unreadable. You just ended your career, he said. Maybe. Was it worth it? Sara looked at Beck, looked at the man she'd thought was dead, the man she'd carried as a ghost for 18 months, the man who'd been alive and suffering while she'd been safe in Montana, convincing herself that his death was her fault. Yes, Torres nodded, said nothing else. Didn't need to. The flight back took 8 hours. They landed at Fort Carson at 1400 local time. Briggs was waiting. So was Hastings. So was a medical team that took Beck immediately. So was an MP escort that Sara had expected. Briggs pulled her aside. You disobeyed direct orders, engaged unauthorized targets, extracted an unconfirmed asset without clearance. Yes, sir. General Hastings wants you court-martialed. And you? I want to understand why. Sara looked at him, tired, angry, done pretending. Because your intelligence was wrong. Beck wasn't a traitor. He was a hostage. Volkov and Cross were using his identity to sell information. Beck was captive, being tortured, about to be executed. Your intelligence would have killed an innocent man. I verified. Intelligence was wrong. I adjusted. Mission success. 2 traitors eliminated. 1 asset recovered. If that's worth court-martial, so be it. Briggs stared at her, long enough that Sara thought he might actually arrest her. Then he said something unexpected. Medical is evaluating Beck now. If his story checks out, if he was actually captive, then your judgment was correct and intelligence was wrong. If so, that changes things. And if I'm wrong, then you shot the wrong people and extracted a traitor and we all have a problem. Sara said nothing, because that was the risk. That Beck's story wouldn't check. That she'd been wrong. That trust had betrayed her again the way it had in Kunduz. 24 hours later, results came back. Beck's story checked. Medical confirmed prolonged captivity, malnutrition, injuries consistent with torture. Psychological evaluation confirmed trauma consistent with 3 years of isolation and abuse. Financial forensics confirmed the accounts using his identity had been accessed from locations where Beck couldn't have been. Facial recognition reanalysis confirmed the person in surveillance photos wasn't Beck, but someone similar enough to fool automated systems. Beck was innocent, had been innocent the entire time. Intelligence had been wrong. Sarah's verification had been right. Hastings called a meeting. Sara sat across from her, Briggs to the side, Daniel in the back. "You were right," Hastings said. "Intelligence was compromised. Someone inside was feeding us false identification to eliminate Beck while hiding the real traitors. We're investigating, but that's not your concern anymore." "Why not?" "Because you're blacklisted from future CIA contracts. You demonstrated inability to follow orders, proved you'll make independent decisions in the field. That makes you a liability. I saved an innocent man. You defied direct orders. In our world, that's disqualifying, regardless of outcome. Mission success doesn't excuse insubordination." Sara felt something cold settle in her chest. She'd saved Beck, eliminated traitors, proven intelligence wrong, and her reward was blacklisting. The mission succeeded. Mission succeeded because you got lucky. Next time you might not be lucky, might defy orders and kill the wrong person. We can't risk that. Decision stands. You're thanked for your service, and you don't get called again. Sara stood, walked out, didn't wait for dismissal. She'd stopped caring about protocol somewhere between shooting guards at 3,200 meters and realizing that doing the right thing meant ending your career. Beck found her 2 days later. He was recovering, slowly, still thin, still damaged, but alive. And that was something. "They told me what you did," he said. "You saved me. I verified before shooting, that's all. You also disobeyed orders. Took a career-ending risk, for me. For verification, for doing it right. You just happened to benefit." Beck smiled, small, tired, the kind of smile that hurt. 3 years I was in that cell, thinking everyone was dead, thinking nobody was coming, thinking I'd die there and nobody would know. Then you show up, make a shot nobody else could make, disobey orders to verify, pull me out. You didn't just save my life. You saved me from dying thinking everyone had forgotten I existed. Sara didn't know what to say to that. Didn't know how to explain that she hadn't forgotten. That she'd carried his ghost. That guilt had been the memorial she'd built for him, and now the memorial was unnecessary because he was alive, and guilt could finally transform into something else. "Thank you," Beck said. He walked away, left Sara standing in a mountain air that felt different than it had 2 weeks ago when she'd arrived thinking she was here for training. Daniel found her that evening. "You're blacklisted. Word travels fast." Apparently, Hastings means it. No more government contracts. No more black ops. You're done with that world. Good. I'm tired of shooting people I'm told to shoot. Daniel pulled out a business card, set it on the table between them. Private military contractor. Off books. Handles missions where doing the right thing matters more than following orders. They want someone who asks questions before pulling trigger. Someone who verifies. Someone who'll take career-ending risks if verification shows orders are wrong. Sara looked at the card, plain, white. Just a name and a phone number. No company name, no address. The kind of card that existed in pockets and got passed between people who did work that couldn't be advertised. Who are they? People who've learned that intelligence fails and orders get people killed, and sometimes the only person who can prevent tragedy is the person willing to verify before executing. They want you, if you're interested. Sara picked up the card, held it, thought about what interested meant, thought about whether she wanted to keep doing this, keep shooting, keep carrying the weight of decisions measured in bodies and consequences. She put the card in her pocket. "I'll think about it." 2 weeks later, she was back in Montana. Her truck in the driveway, her cabin unchanged, the mountains still there, still indifferent, still beautiful in the way that distance was beautiful when you looked at it from ground level and didn't think about how hard it was to climb. She unpacked her gear, put the rifle case back in the corner, didn't open it, didn't need to. The rifle was clean, zeroed, ready, same as always. The phone rang, unknown number. She stared at it, let it ring 5 times. 6, finally answered. Kincaid. The voice on the other end was professional, female, efficient. "Miss Kincaid, we have a situation requiring precision expertise and moral judgment. Target is confirmed hostile, but verification recommended before engagement. Window is tight, payment is substantial. Call if interested." Sara looked out the window. Mountains in afternoon light. Sky turning gold the way it did in October. Wind moving through pines with sound like memory. "I'm listening," the voice explained. Details about a target, about intelligence that was probably correct but needed verification, about a shot at 3,400 meters, about doing it right instead of doing it fast. Sara thought about her father, about verification, about the price he'd paid, about the price she'd just paid, about whether paying that price again and again was sustainable or whether eventually the cost accumulated until there was nothing left except the hollow satisfaction of having been right while everything else burned. I'll need verification authority before I accept, she said. The voice didn't hesitate. Granted, that's why we called you. Send details. She hung up, stood there in cabin silence, thought about choices, about the person who verified instead of executing blindly, about whether that person could survive in a world that valued obedience over conscience. No answer came. The phone didn't ring again immediately, but it would. She knew it would, because people who verified were rare and people who could shoot at distances where verification meant something were rarer. And people who'd proven they'd risk everything to verify were rarest of all. She walked outside, sat on the porch, watched the valley darken as sun dropped behind western peaks. Stars came out. The same stars that had been out in Syria when she'd made the choice between orders and conscience. The same stars that had been out in Kunduz when everything had gone wrong. The same stars that would be out when the next mission came and she had to choose again. Her father had told her once that the hardest thing about being a precision shooter wasn't the distance, wasn't the wind, wasn't the math. It was knowing that you had time to think before pulling the trigger, and that thinking meant carrying a responsibility that people who shot without thinking never had to carry. Sara understood now, understood what her father had meant, understood why he'd chosen verification over career, understood why that choice had killed him in a way that no enemy ever could, because the choice had made him someone his own institution couldn't use, and being unusable meant being expendable. She was following his path, had made the same choice, would pay the same price. The question was whether the price was worth paying when the alternative was becoming someone who shot without verifying and lived with the consequences of not knowing whether the targets were actually hostile or just claimed to be by intelligence that was sometimes right and sometimes catastrophically wrong. The phone rang again. Different number. She picked it up. I'm listening. She listened. Long description of a target in a different country. Same pattern. Intelligence said hostile. Verification recommended. Window was tight but possible. The person calling knew her reputation, knew she'd verified in Syria, knew she'd defied orders to save an innocent, wanted that person. The person who cared more about being right than being obedient. When they finished explaining, Sara was quiet for a moment. Then she said the only thing that mattered. I'll verify first. If verification contradicts your intelligence, I abort. If you can't accept that, find someone else. The voice on the phone didn't hesitate. That's exactly why we called you. When can you deploy? Sara looked at the mountains one more time, thought about Beck, about Kunduz, about her father, about the long line of people who trusted her to verify, and the longer line of people who might need that verification in the future. She stood up, walked inside, started packing gear. Send coordinates, she said. I'll be ready in 48 hours. She hung up, pulled out her rifle case, opened it. The rifle was there, clean, maintained, ready. The tools she used to do the thing she did, the thing that required distance and precision and the absolute certainty that you'd verified before executing, because verification was the difference between justice and murder. She closed the case, carried it to the truck, loaded it in the bed, didn't know where she was going yet, didn't matter. The phone would ring, coordinates would come, she'd deploy, she'd verify, she'd shoot or she wouldn't, depending on what verification showed, and she'd live with the choice either way, because living with choices was the price of being someone who made them instead of someone who followed orders without question. 2 years later, people would ask about the precision shooter who operated off book, who verified before engaging, who'd defied orders in Syria to save an innocent, who'd been blacklisted by CIA and hired by everyone who needed someone with the skill to make impossible shots and the conscience to make sure those shots needed making. They'd ask where she was, what she was doing, whether the stories were true. Nobody knew. That was the point. She operated in the spaces between official missions and unofficial needs, took contracts from people who understood that sometimes doing the right thing meant disobeying orders, worked alone, verified always, shot only when verification confirmed the target deserved what came next. And somewhere in Montana, a cabin sat empty most of the year. Windows dark, door locked. Mountains watching over it the way they'd watched over the same valley for millennia before anyone came to disturb the silence, with the sound of rifle shots that echoed and faded and left nothing behind except the memory of having been. The phone rang. Sara answered, listened, verified, deployed. And the cycle continued because the world needed people who verified, and she'd learned the hard way that verification was worth any price, including the price of becoming someone her own country had decided was too dangerous to employ officially. She'd made her choice. Her father had made his. Both had paid. Both had survived long enough to know that surviving wasn't the same as winning. It was just continuing, doing the work, making the hard calls, living with the consequences. And that was enough. It had to be. Because the alternative was stopping. And stopping meant people died who might have lived if someone had verified before pulling the trigger. Sara Kincaid didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Wouldn't stop. The work continued. The phone rang. The missions came. And verification remained. The only principle worth defending when every other principle demanded compromise. She'd chosen it once. Chose it every time the phone rang. Would keep choosing it until the day when choosing stopped being possible, and silence finally came in the form that couldn't be verified away or calculated around or survived through precision alone. But that day wasn't today. Today the phone was ringing. Today verification was needed. Today someone somewhere needed shooting or saving, and only verification would tell which. She picked up. She listened. She verified. The precision continued.